Imagine standing on the sidewalk in a midnight rain, watching your only daughter's life being tossed into the gutter like yesterday's trash. Now imagine that the man doing the tossing has no idea he just signed his own death warrant, socially, financially, and legally. My name is Silas, and I've spent 65 years learning that you don't poke a sleeping grizzly, especially not one that spent half a century building the very ground you're standing on. My daughter, Sarah, is the kind of soul who'd give her last nickel to a stranger, a trait she inherited from her late mother. When she brought Mark home, a slick-talking consultant with hair that cost more than my first tractor, I felt a sour taste in my mouth like a green persimmon. But Sarah saw a diamond where I saw a piece of broken glass. They moved into this glass and steel penthouse in the city, a place so high up it felt like God's waiting room, and for 3 years, I kept my mouth shut. I played the part of the simple country father from the sticks, wearing my faded Carhartt jacket and driving a Ford that's seen more dirt than a gravedigger. Mark looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in on the way to the country club. He thought he was the big dog because he had a view of the skyline. But let me tell you, there is nothing more dangerous than a man who thinks he's better than the people who paved the road he's driving on. Mark's ego started growing faster than a weed in a wet June. Once Sarah told him she was expecting, carrying my first grandbaby, the man didn't celebrate. He didn't go out and buy a crib or start planning for the future. No, he started looking at Sarah like she was a ball and chain. He was climbing the ladder, he said, and a crying infant didn't fit the image he was trying to project to his high society friends. It all came to a head on a Tuesday night that was blacker than a coal mine. I was sitting in my kitchen, cleaning my spectacles, when the phone rang. It was Sarah. She wasn't just crying. She was hyperventilating. Mark had come home in a whiskey-fueled rage, told her he was done playing house, and literally shoved her out the door. He threw her suitcases after her, yelling that he was a king in this city and he didn't need a farm girl dragging him down. Hold on to your hat, because Mark was about to find out that being a king doesn't mean much when someone else owns the kingdom. I was in my truck before the dial tone even faded. It's a 3-hour drive from the farm to the city, but I made it in 2. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel and I wasn't thinking about violence, at least not the kind involving fists. I'm too old for a jail cell, but I'm just the right age for a cold-blooded corporate execution. When I pulled up to that fancy high-rise, Sarah was sitting on her suitcase in the lobby, looking small and broken. The doorman, a young kid who looked like he'd never done a day's hard labor in his life, was trying to ignore her. I walked in, and I didn't see a lobby. I saw a battlefield. I wrapped my arms around my girl, felt her shaking, and I looked up at those gold-plated ceilings. Mark thought he was safe up there on the 42nd floor. He thought he was the master of his domain. What he didn't realize was that Evergreen Development, the company that built this tower and half the zip code, wasn't just a name on a brass plaque. I got Sarah settled into a hotel, the good kind, the kind where they have real silver at breakfast, and I sat by the window watching the city lights. I've spent my life being the quiet one. In my neck of the woods, you don't brag about what's in your bank account. You show your worth by how you treat your neighbors and how you keep your word. Mark had broken the most sacred word there is, a marriage vow, and he'd done it to a woman who was carrying the next generation of my blood. I pulled out my old leather-bound ledger, the one with the contacts I haven't called since the late 90s. People think the world is run by the folks in the newspapers. It's not. It's run by the folks who own the dirt. By 4 a.m., I had 3 of the biggest developers in the tri-state area on the horn, and they weren't annoyed I called so early. They were asking me what I needed. I need to buy a building, I told them, and I need it done before the sun comes up. You see, Mark's penthouse wasn't a condo he owned. It was a luxury lease-to-buy agreement through his firm's executive package. The firm didn't own the building. A shell company did, and that shell company was currently facing a liquidity crisis that only a man with a lot of farm-grown capital could solve. By the time the pigeons started fluttering in the park, the digital ink was drying on a deal that would make a Wall Street shark blush. I wasn't Silas the farmer anymore. I was the chairman of the board, and I was about to go on a site inspection that Mark would never forget. If you think a man's heart can't stop from pure terror while he's sipping his morning espresso, you've never seen a man realize he's just insulted his new boss. The sun hadn't even cleared the skyscrapers when I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror. I wasn't wearing that Carhartt jacket today. I dug out a charcoal suit I'd had tailored in London 20 years ago, the kind of fabric that doesn't scream, it whispers. Mark always thought I smelled like manure and diesel, but today, I wanted him to smell the scent of old cold money. As I stepped back into that lobby, the doorman from the night before started to open his mouth to tell me loitering wasn't allowed. But he caught one look at my eyes and froze. I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I was the man who signed his paycheck, and somewhere deep in his gut, he knew the weather had changed. You're about to see what happens when a man who thinks he's self-made realizes he's actually been living on borrowed time and someone else's dime. I didn't head for the elevator. Not yet. I walked straight into the building manager's office. A fella named Mr. Henderson who wore a suit 2 sizes too small and an attitude 3 sizes too big. He started to give me the high and mighty routine, telling me he was terribly busy with a high-profile tenant issue. I didn't say a word. I just laid a single manila folder on his desk. It contained the deed transfer, the corporate buyout papers, and a personal note from the CEO of the parent bank. Henderson's face went from a dull red to the color of a spoiled glass of milk in under 6 seconds. He looked at the papers, then at my weathered hands, and then he stood up so fast he nearly tipped his chair into the window. The simple farmer was gone, and in his place stood the man who could turn this entire luxury high-rise into a parking lot if I felt the whim. "Mr. Silas," he stammered, his voice cracking like a dry twig under a boot. We weren't expecting a site visit from the new ownership so soon. How can I facilitate your needs?" I leaned over his desk, not far enough to be aggressive, just enough to let him smell the peppermint on my breath. I told him I wanted the master key to the 42nd floor and a copy of the morality and conduct clause in the executive lease agreements. You see, these big city fancy pants lawyers love to write rules to keep the riffraff out, but they forget those same rules can be used to kick a king off his throne if he stops acting like a gentleman. Mark had violated 3 different clauses the moment he laid a hand on my daughter and tossed her into the night. If you ever want to see a man's soul leave his body, watch him realize the person he bullied is the only person who can keep a roof over his head. I took the elevator up. The ride was quiet, just the hum of the cables and the pounding of my heart. Not from anger, but from the cold, hard focus of a man finishing a job. When the doors chimed on the 42nd floor, I stepped out onto the plush carpet. I could hear music playing from inside the penthouse. It was loud, upbeat celebration music. Mark was in there, probably pouring a glass of expensive scotch to toast his freedom from the burden of a wife and a child. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I used the master key Henderson had given me with trembling hands. I pushed the door open, and there he was, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city like he owned every brick and every soul in it. He turned around, a smirk playing on his face that quickly curdled into a look of pure, unadulterated confusion when he saw me standing in his living room. "Silas?" he barked, trying to regain his alpha stance. "How the hell did you get in here? I told Sarah last night the farm tour is over. You've got 5 minutes to get out before I have security drag your old bones down to the curb." He walked toward me, puffing out his chest, still convinced I was just a nuisance he could swat away like a fly. I didn't flinch. I just looked around at the Italian marble and the designer furniture my daughter had picked out, by the way. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a gold pocket watch that belonged to my father, and clicked it open. "You're right about one thing, Mark," I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. "The tour is over, but I'm not the one leaving." Mark started to laugh, a dry, mocking sound that made me want to show him exactly how we handle coyotes back home but I kept my cool. "You've gone senile, old man," he sneered, reaching for his phone to call the front desk. "This is an executive suite. My firm pays for this. I'm the golden boy of this zip code." He pressed the speed dial for Henderson, his eyes locked on mine with a nasty glimmer of triumph. He waited for the voice on the other end to tell him I was being removed. Instead, he heard Henderson's voice, trembling and hushed, telling him that an emergency eviction notice had been filed 10 minutes ago for gross lease violations and endangering a co-tenant. Mark's phone slowly slid from his ear as his face turned a ghostly shade of gray. He looked at the phone, then at me, his mouth hanging open like a landed trout. The high and mighty architect was about to find out that when you build your house on sand, you shouldn't be surprised when the tide comes in. "What did you do?" he whispered, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. I took a step forward, into his personal space, letting the weight of my presence fill the room. I told him that I didn't just buy his building. I'd spent the last 4 hours buying up the debt of the firm he worked for, too. In the business world, they call it a hostile takeover. On the farm, we just call it weeding the garden. I told him that by noon, his boss would be calling him, not to congratulate him on a promotion, but to tell him his security clearance had been revoked and his desk had been emptied into a cardboard box. Mark fell back into one of those expensive leather chairs, the very one Sarah had bought him for his birthday, and for the first time he looked me in the eye and saw who I really was. Mark sat there shivering like a dog passing peach pits. He looked around his palace, and for the first time he realized the walls were closing in. "You can't do this," he whimpered, his voice sounding like a rusted gate hinge. "There are laws. I have rights." I just leaned against his fancy wet bar and checked my watch again. I told him he was right. There are laws, and there are people who spend their whole lives making sure those laws bite the right ankles. I told him he had exactly 60 minutes to pack whatever he could carry in 2 hands, because at 10 a.m., the locks were being changed, and anything left inside was going to be donated to the local women's shelter in Sarah's name. The funny thing about status is that it's like a cheap coat. It looks good until the first storm hits, then it just falls apart at the seams. Mark scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around like a trapped rat. He tried to get tough again, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you're so smart? You think buying a building makes you a god? I'll call my lawyers. I'll call my brother. You have no idea who my brother is. Silas. He's the most ruthless litigator in this city. He'll have you tied up in court until you're buried in that dirt you love so much." He started pacing, getting his wind back, convinced that his secret weapon was going to save his skin. He pulled out his phone and started barking orders into the receiver, telling this legendary brother to get down here and liquidate the old man. When a man starts bragging about his connections, it's usually because he doesn't have any backbone of his own to lean on. I just pulled up a chair, the comfortable one, and told him to go right ahead. I told him I'd love to meet a ruthless litigator. In fact, I told him to tell his brother to bring every scrap of paper he had. Mark was smirking again, tapping his foot, thinking he'd finally found my blind spot. "He's 5 minutes away," Mark sneered. "He's been waiting for a reason to tear someone like you apart. You're playing in the big leagues now, old man. You should have stayed on the tractor." I just nodded and asked him if he wanted a glass of water, seeing as his throat sounded a bit tight. He ignored me, standing by the door like he was waiting for the cavalry to ride in and save his miserable hide. There's a special kind of silence that happens right before a lightning strike, a heavy pressure in the air that tells you the world is about to change. The door chimes rang. Mark practically leaped at the handle, pulling it open with a flourish. "Tell him, Elias. Tell this old fossil what's about to happen to him." A man walked in, dressed in a suit that cost more than Mark's entire car. He was sharp, cold, and had eyes like a hawk. He looked at Mark, then he looked at the boxes piled by the door, and then he looked at me sitting in the corner. Mark was rambling, pointing at me, shouting about illegal eviction and harassment. But the brother, Elias, didn't say a word to Mark. He didn't even acknowledge the man's existence. He walked straight over to me, stopped 2 feet away, and took off his hat. The big bad wolf didn't come to bite. He came to heal, and Mark's face started to turn a shade of blue I've only seen on a July plum. "Mr. Silas," Elias said, his voice deep and respectful, echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "I got your message. I assume this is the domestic matter you mentioned on the phone last night." Mark's jaw didn't just drop. I thought it was going to hit the floorboards. He looked from me to his brother, his eyes bulging. "Elias? What are you doing? This is the man who's kicking me out. Sue him. Ruin him." Elias finally turned to look at Mark, and the look of pure disgust on his face was enough to wither a cornfield. "Shut up, Mark," Elias snapped. "You didn't tell me the farm girl you were dumping was Silas Thorne's daughter. You didn't tell me you were being a low-life coward to the family that put me through law school. It's a bitter pill to swallow when you realize the person you were planning to use as a shield is actually the one holding the sword. You see, 30 years ago, when Elias was just a brilliant kid from a broken home working 3 jobs to get through college, I was the one who saw his potential. I was the one who set up the anonymous scholarship that paid his tuition. I was the one who gave him his first retainer when he started his firm. Elias wasn't just a ruthless litigator. He was a man who understood the concept of a debt of honor. He looked at Mark like he was a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "I'm not here to represent you, Mark," Elias said coldly. "In fact, I'm here to make sure the divorce papers Sarah is filing are so airtight you'll be lucky to keep your socks. You're done in this city. I'm personally seeing to it. When the man who knows where all your bodies are buried starts digging a hole, you know the game is well and truly over." Mark collapsed onto his suitcase, the reality finally hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had no penthouse, no job, and now even his own blood was turning against him. He looked at me, pleading with his eyes, but I didn't have any mercy left in the tank. Not for a man who'd throw a pregnant woman out into a midnight storm. I stood up, smoothed out my suit, and told Elias to handle the paperwork. I walked to the door, but I stopped just long enough to look back at the man who thought he was a king. "The dirt you wanted my daughter to go back to?" I said quietly. "It's a lot more comfortable than the concrete you're about to be sleeping on." Mark didn't just lose his keys that day, he lost his name. As I walked out of that penthouse, I could hear him wailing behind me, a sound like a coyote caught in a trap of its own making. But a man like me knows that an eviction is just a haircut. What Mark needed was a total reckoning. I pulled out my phone and made one more call to a fella who runs the biggest recruitment firm in the tri-state area. I told him that a certain architect was currently on the market, and that anyone who hired him would be finding their future building permits stuck in a heap of red tape for the next decade. True power isn't about shouting from the rooftops. It's about being the person who owns the roof, the air above it, and the ground beneath. By lunchtime, the blacklist was already in effect. Mark went to his office to try and smooth things over with his boss, but the security guards were already waiting at the revolving doors. They didn't even let him inside to grab his world's greatest boss mug. They handed him a plastic bag with his stapler and his framed degrees, then escorted him to the sidewalk while his former colleagues watched from the windows above. He tried to call his work buddies for a place to crash, but every single one of them had suddenly developed a very convenient case of amnesia. They didn't want to be anywhere near the man who had managed to offend the Thorne family. When you spend your whole life climbing a ladder made of other people's backs, don't be surprised when they all decide to stand up at the same time. I went back to the hotel to check on Sarah. She was sitting by the window, rubbing her belly and looking out at the city she'd once been so afraid of. I told her that the penthouse was hers now, truly hers. I transferred the deed into a trust for her and the baby. But Sarah, being the woman of character she is, shook her head. She didn't want the glass palace anymore. She said that place smelled like Mark's cologne and broken promises. She wanted to go back to the farm, back to the dirt, where things actually grow. I felt a lump in my throat bigger than a walnut. My girl was coming home, but she was coming home as the owner of the very company that had tried to push her out. The greatest revenge isn't taking what someone else has. It's realizing you never needed their permission to be happy in the first place. But we weren't done with Mark just yet. A week later, he was spotted at a two-bit motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon sign flickers and the towels feel like sandpaper. He was down to his last few $100s, his credit cards having been frozen for investigation by the bank I happened to sit on the board of. He sat in that cramped room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, realized that he couldn't even get a job bagging groceries in this town. Word had spread. In our world, how you treat your pregnant wife is the only resume that matters, and Mark's resume was written in coal and ash. A man can survive a storm if he has a sturdy house, but when he burns his own roof for warmth, he's got no right to complain about the frostbite. Sarah and I were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, the smell of honeysuckle heavy in the air, when Elias, Mark's brother, pulled up the gravel drive. He wasn't there to argue. He handed Sarah a thick envelope. It was the final settlement. Mark had signed over every penny of his remaining savings and his portion of the family estate just to get Elias to stop the legal onslaught. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to ensure my grandchild would never have to ask a man like Mark for a dime. Elias sat with us, drank a glass of my sweet tea, and apologized for his brother's existence one last time. It takes a big man to admit his kin is rotten, and it takes a bigger man to help you prune the dead wood off the family tree. The last I heard of Mark, he'd hopped a bus for the West Coast, hoping to find a place where nobody knew the name Silas Thorne. But the funny thing about the world today is that it's gotten real small. I made sure his conduct report was uploaded to every professional database from sea to shining sea. He'll find work eventually, I reckon. Maybe hauling trash or painting fences, but he'll never sit in a high-back chair again. He'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if the man he's talking to is another friend of the farmer. They say the wheels of justice grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine, and Mark was currently being turned into dust. As for Sarah, she's glowing. The farmhouse is filled with the sound of renovation. We're building a nursery that'll be the envy of the county. She's taking over the Evergreen Charitable Foundation, making sure no other woman in this city ever finds herself on a midnight sidewalk with nowhere to go. We're planting a new orchard this spring, too. It's a reminder that no matter how much concrete and steel you pile up, life always comes back to the soil. And the soil, unlike a two-bit son-in-law, never forgets who took care of it. The nursery was finished just as the first frost hit the pumpkin patch, and it was a sight to behold. We didn't use any of that cold, gray marble from the city. We used reclaimed oak from our own woods and painted the walls the color of a summer sky. Sarah spent her afternoons rocking in a chair that used to be her grandmother's, looking out at the rolling hills. She was a different woman, stronger like tempered steel. She'd realized that Mark hadn't broken her. He'd just stripped away the dead weight so she could finally see the power she'd had all along. Sometimes you have to lose a fake life to realize you've been sitting on a gold mine of real happiness the whole time. Word reached us through the grapevine that Mark had finally found a job. He wasn't designing skyscrapers or sipping martinis with CEOs. He was working at a car wash in a dusty town outside of Reno, scrubbing the bugs off the grills of trucks just like mine. I heard he tried to tell the other workers he used to be a big deal in the city, but they just laughed and told him to get back to the hubcaps. He was living in a trailer that shook when the wind blew, finally understanding what it feels like to be disposable. He reached out to Elias once, begging for a loan, but Elias just sent him a copy of the building's new bylaws, under new ownership. There's no heavier burden in this world than the memory of a life you threw away because you thought you were too big for your britches. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy, screaming boy named Silas Jr., the whole county seemed to celebrate. We had a barbecue that lasted 2 days, and for the first time in years, the Thorne name wasn't associated with business deals or property deeds. It was associated with new life. I stood on that porch, holding my grandson, looking out at the land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I realized then that my revenge wasn't about the penthouse or the bank accounts. It was about making sure this little boy grew up in a world where men are judged by their character, not their cufflink. The best way to silence a man who tried to ruin your future is to build a future so bright it blinds him from 1,000 miles away. I still keep that photo of the penthouse in my office, though, not because I miss it, but as a reminder. Every now and then, when I'm feeling the aches in my joints, I look at that glass tower and I think about the night of the storm. I think about how Mark thought he was a giant because he stood on a tall building, and how he looked when he realized he was just a small man in a very large world. Keeps me humble, and it keeps me sharp. You don't have to be the loudest dog in the yard to be the one who guards the gate. A man's legacy isn't written in the stone of a building. It's written in the hearts of the people he protected when they couldn't protect themselves. Sarah is the CEO of the Thorne Foundation now, and she's already bought 3 more buildings in the city. Not to flip them for profit, but to turn them into affordable housing for single mothers. She's taking the very status Mark worshipped and using it to lift up the people he looked down on. She's a Thorne through and through, and every time she walks into a boardroom in her boots and denim, the big shots stand up a little straighter. They know her story. They know that behind that smile is a woman who knows exactly how to take a kingdom back. If you ever find yourself at a crossroads, wondering if you should take the high road or the low road, just remember, the high road has a much better view of the people trying to sneak up on you. So, if you're ever driving through our part of the country and you see a modest farmhouse with a Thorne sign at the gate, don't be fooled by the old trucks or the faded paint. Inside that house is a family that knows the true value of the dirt beneath their feet. We've survived the storms, we've weeded the garden, and we've come out the other side stronger than ever. And as for the brother who was supposed to ruin me, well, Elias is coming over for Sunday dinner tomorrow. We're having fried chicken and talking about the future. Because at the end of the day, family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the midnight rain starts falling.